yeah, excited to talk to you all about biochar. So I just wanted to reference, these are the two books that a lot of the information will be coming from. Uh, Burn was the kind of the first book that I started reading about biochar. This is very much for the lay people. Um, it is kind of sciencey, but it's pretty much written for everyone, and that'll go from kind of every topic from biochar in soil to biochar in concrete, biochar in as an additive to like livestock feed, even biochar and cryptocurrency. So it's a really broad book. And then on the right, you know, biochar for environmental management, very much a textbook. It's kind of like the textbook on biochar at this point. The author here, Johannes Lehmann, or the editor, he's up at Cornell, Ithaca. He's kind of the foremost biogeochemist that's working on this. A lot of times, if you're looking at the International Biochar Council, he's going to be somewhere there. And he's surprisingly responsive to email, which is nice. But just wanted to recognize the shoulders I'm standing on with this information. And start with some definitions and terms, because it's helpful to have some shared language around this stuff. So in the biochar textbook, they have this definition for biochar. And I think it's okay. It's biochar is a product of heating biomass in the absence of or with limited air to about 250 degrees Celsius, a process called pyrolysis. I've been doing this for 2 years, and I've never been able to come up with a one sentence answer to what is biochar. But this next bullet point is the closest thing I've gotten so far. It's just, this is my definition. Biochar is a form of activated charcoal used for agricultural and carbon storage purposes. So kind of similar to the first one, but figured it's kind of helpful to talk about, you know, what actually is biochar. Biomass, right, that's any living matter. In our case, I'm talking specifically about wood, but there's plenty of things you can char. And then char is just the blackened remains of fire. I end up just calling biochar char a lot of the time, but just there is a correct words. And I'll try to use the correct language throughout this. But I think this is a helpful graph to look at. So this is looking at all the scientific papers and journals written that are about biochar. And you can see kind of in 2008, it kind of kicks off. And after that point, people get really, really excited about biochar and studying biochar. There's a really similar graph looking at basically analyzing the entire internet and looking at articles and web pages that just have the word biochar. And it's almost a mirrored graph. So what was so exciting in 2008 that got people talking about this? And that's looking at, it's called the Terra Preta. That's the soils in the Amazon. So essentially folks in the mid 2000s were looking at where humans were settled in the Amazon. And they were noticing that the soil was incredibly dark, really fertile, and really rich with organic matter and carbon, which is pretty strange because on the right that's kind of a typical view of rainforest soil. A lot of the nutrients in the rainforest are actually in the living canopy and in all the plants and biomass. The soil itself is pretty poor. So what they were finding was that the slash and burn techniques that indigenous peoples were using ended up creating really, really rich soil. And this kind of sparked a lot of light bulbs in a lot of heads, just thinking, okay, well, this carbon has actually been here for hundreds to thousands of years. So maybe this is a really great way to store carbon. So, right, that's just a great question. Biochar, why biochar it's a low cost, low tech carbon storage. So just to kind of think about how this works, is a little refresher on the carbon cycle. There's a short term and there's a long term carbon cycle. The short term, also called the biogenic. This is what we kind of think about, where trees are sequestering carbon from the atmosphere into their bodies the whole time they're alive, and then when they die and are digested, that carbon is released back out to the atmosphere. So this is the short-term cycle. This is kind of what normally regulates the planet's climate. And right, this is what's scary about fossil fuels, is that it's coming from the long-term cycle and being burned into the air, and the biogenic cycle can't quite keep up. With biochar, what we're able to do is we're able to, like that definition was talking about, pyrolyze or cook at high temperature, low oxygen, and we're able to actually store about 50% of the carbon in biochar. So we're able to take it out of the short-term carbon cycle and put it back into the long-term cycle. And so we lose about 50% of the carbon to the process, and that does create energy. So if it's done on a big enough scale and you're able to capture that heat energy from that reaction, this can actually be a carbon negative process, right? Because you're storing carbon and you're also offsetting use of fossil fuels to create energy. And so what we're really doing here is we're trying to create a circular economy. We don't want to be growing things just to cut them down to turn biochar. We want to find waste streams, and those waste streams can then become biochar. So we're using waste streams, getting them out of a landfill, and making a consumer product with it. So one of the really exciting things about biochar is it's not just carbon storage, it's actually a really effective soil amendment. So a couple of the big takeaways is it can really increase your soil water holding capacity, right? So it acts like a sponge and will hold on to water and slowly release that back into the soil. So it really increases drought tolerance. It has a really high cation exchange capacity. So that's kind of a fancy way of saying it's a negatively charged particle. So a lot of our plant nutrients, when you think of nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium, these are all positively charged ions. And what biochar can do is actually bind to them and hold them into the soil. So one of the things about conventional agriculture is they're dumping kind of thousands of pounds of mineralized nutrients onto their soils, and the soils don't have a high enough organic matter content to really hold on to them. So the Gulf of Mexico, the Chesapeake Bay, a lot of our waterways end up with a lot of nutrient runoff because those soils can't hold on to it. But biochar is really, really helpful. It's negatively charged, and it's going to hold on to those nutrients in the soil and make them available to our plants. And then it creates a really excellent habitat for soil biology. Because it's such a stable molecule, because it's so hard for microorganisms to break down, it creates a really healthy environment for those microorganisms to thrive. You can look at, this is a scanning electron microscope image of biochar. There's just a ton of, it's really porous, ton of tubes for things and nooks and crannies for them to all stay in. So the metaphor people say is it's like, it's like burying a coral reef. It just really creates an abundance of places for your soil biology to live. So humans have used char on every continent, dating basically prehistory times, which is really exciting. This is a deeply human activity to char something and then put it into the soil to help grow things. So we're just going to talk about a couple different methods that have basically been around on the planet, since before we started writing things down. With rice cultivation, which is a cool thing. I was reading about, I think the oldest record of rice cultivation is about 12,000 years ago along the Yangtze River in China, and some of the earliest writings around how to grow rice talks about fertilize with fire and weed with water. This is just an incredibly old technique. Slash and burn. The first time I've heard that, I think it sounds scary. It sounds like you're cutting down the forest and lighting on fire. In reality, you're cutting down a very small section. You can imagine if you're going to cut down 1 acre and farm it communally, you can actually get a ton of vegetables from there. So what indigenous people have done all over the world, they would cut down a small section of the forest, grow on it for 1 to 3 years, and then move on to the next one. And what happens really really well is it creates a patchwork or mosaic of uh, different early forms of succession, right? So you can imagine what used to be last year's cropland is now kind of a nice meadow, which might be really helpful for hunting grounds, or as those thick scrubby brushes come in and berries come in, it can bring in all the birds. So it's actually a really sustainable and really excellent way to manage forest land, and that's why that terra preta soil was formed. Another version of this is called Pelagian soils. There's a lot of fun, very long German words that talks about Pelagian soils. This method was mostly, instead of using forests, it's uh, using a lot of leaf litter and roots and grasses as animal bedding, and then mixing that bedding once animals have urinated and added their manure to it, and then adding wood ash and biochar to that, and then adding that to our fields. So Pelagian soils have been formed kind of all over the world. Real notable ones are in Northern Europe, and people are still growing on those soils today. They're kind of the most fertile areas in Northern Europe, which is really interesting, just that this practice is very old and it's continued fertility. I thought this image was really cool. This is from New Zealand. You kind of see where how the Maori people kind of developed this really excellent, dark, rich, fertile soil, and you can kind of see the little tiny bit that Europeans have settled on there. But they're doing this all on top of shells. This is what was there before. So just to say that biochar is not something new, right? It's the scientific method is new to biochar, but this is kind of one of the oldest practices that humans have been doing for a long time, and we're kind of relearning how to do it in the best ways. So why build soil in the city? You know, why think about it this way is, for the most part, city lots have very little to no topsoil. They're usually very compacted. So there's basically, if you can imagine a building sitting on top of the lots, the soil itself is very hard to dig into, and it's going to be filled with rubble. So I pulled all sorts of bricks or sidewalk chunks out of the soil. Sometimes, you know, full pieces of foundation, and then for almost the past century and a half, slag from steel mills was readily available for anyone who wanted free fill. So a lot of yards, a lot of places in Pittsburgh are built on top of slag. A lot of the hills in Frick Park are previous slag dumps. And with that comes a ton of heavy metal contamination, also from leaded paint and leaded gasoline. But in short, our soils are in a kind of a rough shape in Pittsburgh and in urban areas in general. Um, and so I kind of wanted to talk about how folks have been working soils for thousands of years to kind of bring it back to now. Is we've created anthropic soil kind of wherever we're interacting with soil. There are really healthy and good ways to work with anthropic soils, which we just talked about, and there's plenty of very detrimental ways to make anthropic soil, like filling it with slag. And so if we're doing it right, you know, we can start really filling our soils with organic matter, with carbon, with things that are going to benefit the following generations. And just a fun little side note, the high cation exchange capacity, that negative charge of biochar, is actually really good at binding up heavy metals and making them, it doesn't remove them from the soil, but it makes them very difficult for plants to interact with. They're less bioavailable. So that's another great plus of biochar. So I wanted to just take a second to look at kind of traditional charcoal making. Biochar and charcoal, right? We're saying that first slide, biochar is a form of activated charcoal. So as people were getting really into biochar and trying to figure out the best ways to make it, a lot of that knowledge is kind of resting on traditional charcoal use. So again, charcoal is a very, very old substance. Before people were mining for coal, charcoal was used to heat homes, to fire pottery kilns, for metalworking, right? It's a very reliable, easy to ignite fuel source. So charcoal making, which I think would have been a fun job back in a couple hundred years ago, but you can kind of see this back pile of a ton of sticks and logs all piled up. And then in this front image, it's all covered in dirt, and there's steam coming out. So what they would do is they would light these piles at the very tip, while it's all covered in dirt, and then let that smolder. And so it's a little tough to see, but these are kind of steam vents. This is steam shooting out from the wood, from the piles. And the kiln that I'll talk about later, the kiln that I use, creates a good amount of steam as well. But I think this is just kind of helpful to look at these images and think about how charcoal is made. And so this is kind of a cross section of it. You can see that middle chamber, that they would light from, and how they would stack everything. And then you'd have these big piles. They would smolder for a couple of days, and then you would be able to head to the city and with a whole ton of charcoal and sell it to people to heat their homes. So the difference between biochar and charcoal, I really like this image because from this image, it's really impossible to tell the difference between charcoal and biochar. And that's why I wanted to talk about charcoal, is because with charcoal and biochar, the main difference is your end usage, right? So this is how you would make something if you want to burn it. And then I'll talk about all the methods of making biochar, right? Biochar is not meant for burning, it's meant for soil amending. And so the big difference here is we need to activate the charcoal. So what we do in my system is we quench it. So when the reaction is done, we'll dump a ton of water on it. That steam, that's one way of activating charcoal is with steam. That'll stop any tars from forming in the wood. This is a great method for creating tars in wood because that will smolder for a really long time and give it time to build up those tars. So what we want to do with biochar, right, is quench it. It's basically the same process up until that last point. So we want to take a second and just think about feedstocks and feedstocks versus fuel sources. They seem kind of interchangeable, but feedstock is going to be anything that is going to become biochar. Your fuel source is anything that you are burning to create heat to then create the pyrolysis reaction. Does that make sense? I hope that's a helpful difference. So for example, coconut husks, rice hulls, nutshells, these are all things that will become biochar. Rice hulls, this is pretty interesting. I was reading about how in Japan, right, all the straw from the rice was used just as straw for animal bedding, for a ton of uses. It was also used to make sandals and hats, and then the rice was eaten, right? So the only remaining bit was the hulls. And so that's kind of the story around biochar is, what is the waste product that you can't use for anything else? You figure out a way to char it. I actually had talked to Johannes Lehmann. I'd emailed him a bunch about working with knotweed, and his response was, you can char anything you want, you can char, or make biochar with. Each one of these inputs, each one of these feedstocks is going to end up with a pretty different product, right? So it's gonna act differently. But I would suggest, if you're interested in making this, what material do you have readily available around you? Just thinking about knotweed, right? If you don't know it, it's an invasive plant, grows all over the hillsides in Pittsburgh. I've tried it as a fuel source. It doesn't have enough BTUs or energy to really get the pyrolysis reaction going, so it doesn't burn hot enough. And then using it as a feedstock, it basically gets too hot and just kind of turns to ash. So I've tried, the kiln I have isn't meant for knotweed. Some kilns can work with bamboo, but yeah, I tried my hardest, and knotweed is not the answer, or biochar not the answer for knotweed. I was hoping it would work out. Biosolids, Stockholm has a pretty cool system where they'll actually char their municipal solid waste. So they'll char their poo, And then I think it's 300 homes in Stockholm get heated that way. And then, yeah, basically, if you're a citizen of Stockholm, you can use that char for free, which is a pretty cool setup. I kind of wish we had something like that here. But then hard and soft woods. This is what I use primarily. This is the waste stream available to me. Hardwoods and wood in general is kind of one of the better feedstocks for going into soil amending. Hardwood a little bit better than softwood, but generally the idea is the structure of the wood is really conducive to being pyrolyzed. It can save a lot of the tubes, the xylem and phloem that are in the wood. It can maintain those tubes. So if you think back to that electron microscope image, there's all those tubes. That's going to be from a hard or softwood. So there's a ton of different methods for making biochar, and you kind of have to think, which kiln is right for you. Similarly, which waste stream is available to you, which kiln can work the best for you. On the right, this is called a champion cook stove. This has won a bunch of international competitions. This is a pretty neat setup. It basically, there's a burner right on top, so it'll be creating biochar, and you can just use the waste heat right there to cook your meals. So while you're cooking, you're actually creating a small little batch of biochar that you can then throw in your compost pile. So this is a pretty cool one. You might see it described as a TLUD champion cook stove. That's an acronym for top lit upward draft. And I'll get into that a little bit more. That just means that you start a fire on the top, and then the shape of it pulls air in and creates an upward draft. I'll get into Kontiki and retort in a second. The continuous feed auger, this is a method used by like really large scale manufacturing. Basically, you can keep the reaction going for a very long time. This one isn't quite available on a smaller scale, right? The Kontiki, the retort, and then the cook stove are all things you can do at your own home, your homestead, your farm, kind of whatever it is. But the continuous feed auger, this is if you're a pretty big manufacturing plant. So maybe one day we'll get there, but probably not. The Kontiki kiln, this is a pretty neat one. I've never actually seen one of these in person. I'd love to actually get a chance to look at this and do some burns with it. It's essentially this really large cone-shaped thing. I've seen some that don't have any legs. It just sits right on the ground. And the idea is you kind of start a fire in the bottom of it and continuously add wood to the top. So by the end of it, you have an enormous cone filled with coals, and then just a little bit of it, which is on top. So basically it robs the whole inside of the cone of oxygen, and that's going to create that pyrolysis conditions, that high temperature, low oxygen. This is really great if you have a bunch of brush you're trying to clear. People who have orchards use stuff like this, or maybe you have a wood lot where you're cutting down stuff and you can kind of just throw all these things of different sizes into this kiln. I've seen some cool. There's a group called the Carbon Conservation Corps. I think they're either in Oregon or Colorado, but they've been trying to get Kontiki kilns or versions of this kiln to landowners so that they can be cooking, basically doing good fire management practices of kind of clearing a lot of scrub and things that would catch and burn really well, and kind of intentionally burning it and making biochar in the process. But yeah, it's more popular in rural settings. I wouldn't suggest this in the city because it is very much just a big open flame. So maybe not the best for right here, but if you move a little bit outside the city, then this might be for you. So this is the biochar retort oven or kiln. This is a very, very similar one to the one that I use. And it looks a little confusing, but it's essentially a 30-gallon drum nestled inside a 50-gallon drum or 55-gallon drum. The 30-gallon drum rests on these two bricks. It's sealed on the top and it has a couple holes on the bottom. So what we're able to do is load the smaller barrel with our feedstock, right? So we're going to be using waste wood. We'll fill that up. And then the space between the two barrels, that gets filled with our fuel source. In my case, that's also wood. But maybe this can be pallet wood or something that you don't actually isn't actually that helpful around the farm or around the house. Wood that you can kind of just get rid of. That can be your fuel sourse. And so what it's going to do is it's going to get very, very hot. And then this inner chamber will start pyrolyzing. It's going to start off-gassing and will cook everything that's not carbon out of the wood. And now that gas will flow from the bottom and then actually become the next fuel source. So eventually more gas will come out. That will get the fire hotter to make this off gas even more, and then make the fire hotter. And you get kind of a chain reaction. And it's pretty clear once the reaction is done, because this outside of the barrel, especially if you're doing it at night, you can see it kind of glow red. And sometimes there's even flames shooting out the top of it. And then the temperature really drops. It's no longer glowing red, and you know at that kind of time. Just a little side note: these little triangles, these are air holes. So this is again that top lit upward draft will make a fire at this top part. That will make it suck air through the bottom and go up the stovepipe, and that'll create the draft that we want. So yeah, here's one of these in person. This is the one that I made with my friend. You can kind of see some ash pouring out of the air intake holes throughout the bottom. There's some more intake holes at the top. And you can see this is in a very populated area. This is in the Southside Slopes, not an ideal place to be making charcoal. But we only did it a couple of times there. We talked to the neighbors, and they begrudgingly were okay with it. And that's why it was really helpful to talk to John, because the Garfield farm is kind of removed a little bit from neighbors, and there's a nice little tucked away spot. So that's our retort kiln on the left. On the right is the first couple of loads of waste wood that I got. So this is from Ed Johnson, who he's the Wilderness Lumber Company. He does a lot of his own milling around Western PA. And generally, this whole project got started because I was working with Grow Pittsburgh, and Ed would make our raised beds and sheds, and he would have all this scrap wood, basically just going into a dumpster and then a landfill. So I wanted to do something with it, and this is kind of what all that looks like. This is just trying to stack it so it would dry properly. And then we also get scrap wood from the Urban Tree Wood Shop. So they're a custom furniture shop, and so they use mostly hardwood. So this is a mixture of oak, cherry, maple, and then some walnut in there. Occasionally they have some beech, but generally those are the main hardwoods. And then Ed uses hemlock and larch. So there is some softwoods in the mix. But yeah, I take all these kind of weird irregular shaped objects, I cut them all down into smaller pieces, and then put them into this kiln. You don't want anything too large. If you can think of like a 2x2 cube of wood, that's too big. You want things that have as much surface area as possible. So anything bigger than that 2x2x2 cube, this kiln can't get hot enough. So what you'll end up with is it'll look kind of like char, but it'll feel heavier, and you can't break it apart the way you should be able to. So that'll just become, that's more char, not biochar. That little difference there. But yeah, cut it all up. And this is what it looks like on the inside. So again, this is that 30-gallon inside chamber. This is the pyrolysis chamber. All of this is this is feedstock to be turned into char. I'll put this lid on top of that chamber, And then this is actually warped a good deal since we've been getting this so hot. This gets up to about 400 to 500 degrees Celsius. That initial definition of the talked about 250 degrees Celsius, um, that would make a pretty low quality char. That 4 to 500 range is what we're looking for. You can kind of see, it's hard to see, but this white barrel and the blue barrel both have some pretty large scorch marks on there from being too close to the barrel during the reaction. But yeah, this lid has warped a little bit over time. So I usually put that over the feedstock and then put some bricks or rocks over top of it just to try to keep it as snug as possible. And then you can kind of see this is a mixture of, there's some veneer from the wood shop, got some cardboard. We'll seal that up. We'll light this on fire. And honestly, that's kind of the most time consuming process of this, is just sometimes getting a good light on there. But once this is going, we'll put that whole lid with the stovepipe on top. And then that whole reaction takes about 2.5-ish hours. So if I can line everything up just right, I can get this lit, get it going, kind of set it, and then be chopping wood in the meantime. So this is what the char looks like afterwards. It's funny, I have like so many, I know I've taken so many photos just like this, but for whatever reason I couldn't find any on my phone today and yesterday. So this is actually from Wikipedia. But yeah, we're looking at, this is the biochar. Um, it's going to be really easy to crush in your hand. It should just break apart into small pieces. And this is a funny way of saying it, but it should tinkle. Like if you have pieces of biochar and you drop it onto other pieces of char, it kind of makes a light tinkling sound. But yeah, that's kind of a good quality control metric. Um, so once the reaction is done, like we are saying, the whole thing cools down. We'll have big welding gloves, take the stove pipe off, lift this lid, and then quench it. So we'll dump a whole bunch of water onto this, and that steam helps activate the charcoal, make it biochar. But yeah, usually I'll dig around in the barrel, try to just check to see if things have charred thoroughly throughout the whole barrel. And then what we want to talk about particle size is this will be too big to be put directly into the soil. Initially, I was just kind of hitting it all with a hammer. Some people put it in a bag, run it over with their car, and thankfully that's why I partnered with a mechanical engineer. My business partner Mitch made this beautiful crusher. This is a little motor. It spins this wheel, which spins these two steel cylinders together. And so this is the hopper up top. So we'll just kind of dump all of our different shaped char in the top, and then we'll just put a bucket underneath here and collect all the dust that comes out. And the reason we do that is because the smaller the particle size, the greater the surface area. So all those things we were talking about higher cation exchange capacity, taking advantage of that negative charge, better water holding, and more space for the microbes. All of that really comes into play once it's a really small, fine particle size. And this is what it looks like. It kind of looks like dust. It's been honestly a little bit helpful with COVID, just because I always have a mask in my pocket, and if I'm ever moving this stuff around, it can get kind of dusty. So if you do ever end up having this stuff, it's always helpful to kind of wet it very lightly, just to kind of keep dust down. But this part is really helpful. This is an important piece. If you're to put raw biochar into your soil, it's going to immobilize soil nutrients for about 1 to 2 years. If you're looking to amend a lot over time and you're not trying to grow in it right away, you can just put biochar in there and it'll stabilize eventually. But that high negative charge is going to hold on to the nitrogen, and it won't make it available to plants, readily available. So what you have to do, right, is you have to charge or inoculate it. And because it's so absorptive, it's pretty exciting. You can brew teas to kind of fit the exact needs of your soil. And the biochar can be that medium for kind of direct application of stuff. So a couple of different ways of charging it. You can add it into your compost. You can create a tea, like we were saying, like an aerated compost tea, and kind of put the biochar in a mesh bag and just let it absorb all those things. If you have time, right, if you have time on your side, you can mix it 1-to-1 with grass clippings. Um, Obviously, grass that's all organically cared for, but that will capture a lot of that nitrogen that would normally, if you ever have left a pile of grass clippings, it gets stinky real fast. Mixing biochar in with it will stop that stink. Because it's absorbing all that nitrogen. And then urine, that's the one that it's kind of polarizing. Some people are excited about the fact that they can use urine for things. Other people hate the idea of using urine for anything. So it's kind of fun to tell people about that option. But this is a very viable way of capturing a lot of that nitrogen and phosphorus that we waste every time we go to the bathroom. And you're supposed to soak it. So you kind of take that crushed biochar, right, and then you'd kind of add urine to this bucket and let it kind of sit for a couple of days. The first time I talked or learned about urine, I thought it was quenching. So I used diluted urine to quench the system and ended up with like a steam cloud of urine, and it was kind of terrible. But yeah, dilute urine, put it in your buckets. Biochar is a really great at absorbing odors, so you'll actually end up with an odorless product at the end, and it'll be really helpful, really good biochar fertilizer. So thinking about specific county regulations and how to be a considerate neighbor making biochar, this has been pretty exciting because the county health department has no idea how to regulate this. I've been talking with them for the past couple of months, trying to create a permit for this project. So it's been kind of fun to kind of push the bounds of what's being regulated and kind of open the door for other people to be making biochar. But some helpful tips, right, is you want to check the air quality before burning. Yesterday was a high air quality action day, at least in the morning. So you want to check those things and kind of know when that's happening, because you don't want to be burning on days like that. Using the retort kiln, it creates steam, and it creates white smoke, steam. You are putting particulates into the air, so you just kind of want to be aware of that. So I try to think about burning it off times, so either early in the morning or kind of evening into night, just so there's less people around. And then tell your neighbors what's going on. It's helpful for them to know if they see a bunch of white smoke floating through the air. But it's also fun to just kind of hang out, because it takes, like we were saying, it takes about 2.5 hours to make a batch. So it's fun to have someone to talk to during that. And then this feels like a no-brainer, but I always make sure I have a ton of water that can definitely put the whole thing out, because you are working with a 400-degree Celsius kiln. So just make sure you have enough water to wet the whole thing down if anything bad does happen. So we've gone over a whole bunch of stuff really quickly. So I wanted to just circle back with some takeaways that could be helpful, right? So we're thinking about biochar. It's a low-tech, low-cost carbon storage, overall a carbon negative process if we're using the heat. People have been using it since before recorded history, which is really exciting. And it's very slightly different from charcoal, but biochar is different from charcoal. We talked about different kilns and what those uses are, and then charging and inoculating. And then, of course, the shameless plug for Commonwealth Carbon. So if you're looking for biochar for your garden, for your farm, for your yard, let us know, because we can help you out with that. Yeah, so I wanted to open it up for questions for anyone who has them. I have a couple that people usually ask me, but always want to open it up to folks first. And I can stop sharing my screen too, make it a little bit easier to.
Hey, Russ. Hey, as long as the biochar is inoculated, are you able to use it on a garden right away?
Yeah, yeah. So if you're able to charge it with nitrogen, you can put it right in with your plants.
Cool.
We've used your biochar in our potting mix, and I know I've written this down, but what do you recommend, like ratio wise, if you have a good source of it, like we do, in like doing a potting mix?
Sure.
Other
So
ingredients.
generally the ratio for kind of any soil application is 5 to 10% by volume. So if you think you've got a like a 5 gallon pot you're working with, 5 to 10% of that can be char. Same with the potting soil mixes. Yeah, it's a really great question. And when you're tilling it into the ground, same concepts. 5 to 10%. Yeah, the question that was just on here, right, is the stuff from my leftover from my campfire, is that biochar? Um, yeah, does anyone feel like they can answer that? I didn't talk about that, but yeah, the answer is kind of right. Like if you had the right like kind of a blackened log and you want to throw that into your compost pile, um, what's going to happen is right the parts of it that are charred will stay that way. There's parts of it that are definitely still wood though, so that will be broken down. So kind of imagine the mass of that log will lessen and break apart, but that charred bits will still be there. Um, One of the reasons we use the retort kiln um, is because it's not combusting, so there's not a high ash content. So if you're using stuff from say just the fire pit, there's going to be a higher ash content. So you want to think about pH with that.
Robin has a question.
Yeah, hey, I was wondering if you've read or heard anything about biochar having like an impact on like the allelopathy of invasive plants. I've been reading a little about that and thinking about using it to like combat some aggressive invasives on like a larger scale. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, I haven't tried this yet. I really want to. At least from my understanding with that is like adding it directly to say like a knotweed patch. Um, it should bind up nitrogen in the soil, right? If you're just kind of adding it raw. So I think that's what folks are getting at is like if you're adding this thing, it's going to make less nutrients available to plants kind of immediately, and then you kind of have a window of a year or two where you can be physically removing stuff, but they'll also be um, a little anemic and not as strong. I think that's what they're talking about.
Cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Russ, back to charging your biochar. Is there a test so that you know if you've done it sufficiently?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's not the best home tests you can do. Um, Generally, if you're nervous about that, I would let it go through the composts either longer, or you can just do kind of a simple grow out. So if you have some extra seeds lying around, you can just kind of make little potted plants and see if the plants coming up don't. If they look like light green, they look kind of anemic, then maybe biochar is holding up that nitrogen. Um, but usually, if you're doing those methods, putting in compost, it should be good. It should be all good for you.
Any other questions? I
John?
thought one more. I could.
Sure, yeah.
Oh, Tom's got one.
Thanks, Russ, for having this. It's been very educational, and I'm just learning about biochar. But my question to you is, since you formed a company and everything, are you trying to scale this to do more of it?
Scale the providing it to people and providing advice and stuff. The kiln, I don't want it to get too much bigger. The kiln, at least, just because we are in a neighborhood and I don't want to be putting too much particulate matter in the air. So what we've done so far is order from a larger manufacturer, and so we've got, our hope is that if we're ordering regularly, kind of in bulk, we can get a better price on that and kind of pass that savings on to people. So we're hoping to kind of make value-added products. So, already charged biochar, things like that. So folks can kind of, it's just ready to go right into their garden. And so that's kind of where we're at with it. We're still using it for demonstration purposes and to teach people. And I would love to still make it for the farm's uses, but for the most part, we'll most likely be buying from larger scale producers and adding value to it.
It's very interesting. Like, out of your kiln, like, it looked like a great deal of wood went in. Like, how much biochar did you, like, is there a ratio, like 10-to-1 reduction or 101 to reduction, or how much can you make out of a small kiln like that?
Sure. So that inner chamber is about 30 gallons. You're going to lose about half of that mass just to the reaction. So you end up with about 15 to 20 gallons worth of char. And I know I did it wrong if trying to lift that inner chamber up out of the kiln feels like my back is going to die. That's how I know that this went terribly wrong. I have to do it again.
It's very interesting. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for coming.